And thank you for inviting me to speak. This has been my hometown for a number of years of my life, and so it's fun to be back. This topic is very, very broad. I've spent the last 30 years working in this area, so trying to think about what to say in 30 minutes was a challenge, but I wanted to frame some of the discussions we're having about muscle and bone and speculate about perhaps some way to complement the many things you know so much more about than I do. So again, talk a little bit about a framework, just set that in the context of some of the pragmatic issues about how healthcare is being advised to evaluate falls and how that relates to our interest in muscle and bone. Framing mobility and postural control in terms of the different systems that contribute to it. I'm particularly going to challenge you to ask whether the nervous system has an important role in the dynamics of muscle and bone. So one could ask, what is mobility, which really is just the capacity of an organism to move itself around in space. For us humans, we're bipedal. You can think about the ability to take this mass and move it around over a base that's moving. And because we don't want to spend all our time thinking about moving, we want it to be automatic, and we want to be able to use our upper limbs that are no longer weight-bearing to do things. When mix is developed, we'll talk about the components of what's in mobility. Big, complex system. I had thought about talking to you about measures of mobility, but we could do that for a week. I think it's very attractive to think about something incredibly simple like gait speed as being a widely available, simple marker of mobility. There are innumerable other ones. So the systems that you use to move your body around can be called the postural control systems. There's many systems that is involved in detecting, planning, and implementing movement. I tend to think of it as having three major parts, which are the multiple sensory systems that tell you where you are, what's around you, what your body is doing, a whole set of integrative processes that weigh and bring those sensory systems together, plan movement in advance, and then the parts of the body that are used to carry out the instructions of the central nervous system and bear weight and move the body around. It's important to remember that a lot of this is internally generated, that we plan movement in addition to reacting to the environment. Again, innumerable measures, and in my world, we break this down. We measure it in incredibly simple and incredibly complex ways. And so there are simple clinical indicators of balance and mobility, chair rising, standing with your feet together, and then you can spend millions of dollars biomechanically and physiologically analyzing these things as well. Just want to, again, frame the discussion in terms of the way people who are interested in trying to relate pathologic processes to functions, and let us say that we're interested in developing interventions that ultimately improve function, that we need to think about how you relate disease to function. And there are a number of these disablement models out there. This is one of the simplest, that simply says that there's these underlying pathophysiologic abnormalities that lead to disorders of organ systems, whether it's muscle, whether it's bone, whether it's the nervous system, that impact body movements such as standing and walking, and that abnormalities and those kinds of problems impact your ability to do the stuff you got to do every day, get dressed and walk across the street. And problems with those things interfere with your social roles, like working or taking care of the home. So you can apply this to areas like falls and fractures and just go through these elements and identify components. I work in a NIA-funded Center of Excellence where largely what we're trying to do is build bridges between fundamental processes and clinical relevance. And so we try to build links across these disablement process models. But you can see that at the level of impairments, we can be talking about abnormalities of muscle and bone. So if you were to say at a really big picture level, how does muscle and bone contribute to mobility, falls, and fractures? We could talk again about, let me see if I get my postural control elements with the sensory, central processing, and effector elements, of which muscle strength plays an important role, impacting the ability of the body to move around and stay upright, which in many ways affects what you can do. You and many of us are very interested in issues of bone density and quality. I understand it also matters a lot how much muscle and fat you have around your bones, and then your activity, and these things influence the impact of something like a fall that results in a fracture. So again, very, very big picture. What I hope to argue today is that I was struck that nobody was really talking about the many exciting developments in neurobiology as it influences muscle and bone that also have high clinical relevance in terms of postural control. So just taking a step back, we do have to take our science and make it useful and practical to clinicians. This is the American Geriatric Society Falls Guidelines. They are extremely pragmatic. They are not mechanistic at all. And they're saying all older people should be screened and asked about falls and mobility problems. So you ask people if they've had 2 or more falls, if they've had an injurious fall, or if they are having trouble with walking or balance. And if you get a yes, you go through an evaluation and a management. What they want you to do to evaluate is do some specific things related to fall risk. And the ones that I was struck with here particularly are the obvious impact of gait balance and mobility, and something they're calling other neurologic impairments otherwise not defined. And some of the challenges are that these are actually very complex areas, and it's not really very well operationalized exactly how you do these things. In terms of management, there are, again, very, very practical recommendations. This thing is called an individually tailored exercise program, which is completely undefined. If any of you in here are clinicians, if you send a patient to physical therapy for gait and balance, every single one of them will get a different program. There's no shared model for that. But this is one of the areas where I think the translational opportunities of our work in muscle and bone could be very, very exciting. I think it is useful to have mechanistic understanding of how and why interventions might work. There's nothing in here about those neurological problems you were supposed to find in the evaluation. So to me, one of the exciting opportunities for us to work together is to think about the role of the nervous system in mobility, balance, falls, and fractures, and I would say in muscle and bone. So when I do talks about balance and mobility, I frame these components that we talked about, the sensory, the central processing, and effector components, and I added the arrows because I think these things are, again, very, very integrated, and so there's huge amounts of crosstalk and feedback in all these areas. And so one of the things I hope to talk to you about are some of these crosstalk and feedback issues with muscles and muscle strength. Just going back and looking at, again, if we're doing just risk, you end up with these fairly simplistic models. When you look at all these, quote, risk factors for falls, what you see is the most frequently and most powerfully associated risk factor is weakness, which, as Steve's mentioning, maybe we're calling dynapenia these days as opposed to sarcopenia. And then there's these gait and balance deficits, which are, again, very, very multi-system. So here, this is Todd Manini and Brian Clark. They've been writing about this for a number of years, supported by NIA, talking about muscle weakness. And down here are a lot of the things we're talking about intrinsic properties of muscle, both its volume and a variety of things about its quality. But they're also emphasizing that there is a whole set of processes that are very, very important for generating muscle strength that happen between the brain and all the way out through the neuromuscular junction. So some of the things that I find particularly striking, I think you all know that anyone who does strength training will become stronger long before their muscles get bigger, and that these are purely neurologic mechanisms. And as I'll talk about in a few minutes, there are a variety of effects of aging that influence all of these levels of neurologic function. I think the neuromuscular junction is potentially a really interesting area to explore. As many of you know, this is a very dynamic tissue, both new neuromuscular junctions forming and old ones dying. There's a huge amount of turnover. There's a lot of response to interventions and exercise. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about what's happening here. One of the things that really struck me as I look at this in more detail was that there aren't really any arrows I can tell explicitly discussing how these factors are driving these factors. And I think they do exist. So to what extent are these influences directly affecting elements of excitation, contraction, coupling, and things about muscle synthesis and degradation? Lots of fun things that could be developed here. You probably could tell more than I can. I have no idea how out of the mainstream it is to be thinking about the nervous system and bone, but when I went to the literature, I was struck by arguments that there is important roles for the CNS in regulation of bone mass. And again, we tend to be thinking of skeletal homeostasis as primarily an endocrine activity. We hear a lot about the biomechanics of stress, but this is suggesting that there are direct neural pathways controlling bone homeostasis. And I think this is an exciting area for us to be thinking more about. This is just talking about some of, there are no synapses in bone, but there are a variety of neuropeptides that are neuronal signaling molecules that regulate bone remodeling. They give a number of examples here. The other powerful, apparently, neural influence on bone remodeling is via the autonomic nervous system. So lots and lots of exciting potential partnerships between muscle and bone people and people who are interested in neurobiology. Another whole area that people are talking about in terms of regulation of bone remodeling is via fat and leptin and their influence on control by the hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system. So lots and lots of interesting potential there. Just highlighting my field in aging and some of the things we think about and changes in the aging nervous system. While we do think of neurons as dying and dropping out, they also shrink. This happens not just in the central nervous system, but in the spinal cord. Many of these other things are much more dynamic, just like we think about remodeling in muscle and bone. There is endless remodeling in the nervous system, changes in neural arbors, changes in the myelin sheaths, changes in neural excitability, alterations in autonomic responsiveness, and all kinds of things happening at the neuromuscular junction. So as we think about aging muscle and bone, I think there's, again, a whole basis of neurobiology of aging that we could integrate into our thinking. In terms of where this is going in my world in mobility, balance, and falls, there's just a gigantic literature about neural roles in mobility and balance that are not based on what we traditionally think of as neurologic diseases, are not related to Parkinson's, are not related to stroke. There's a whole world of literature about altered attention and executive function as powerful drivers of falls. As we start thinking about mobility and falls, I think these sorts of things are going to have to be in our risk models. This is, again, talking about some of the potential pathologic processes underlying these changes in the brain associated with executive dysfunction that lead to falls. One of the most powerful factors have been identified are ischemic small vessel changes in the brain that are called age-related white matter changes in a variety of periventricular and deep frontal areas, and this is suggesting that this phenomena is associated with falls. This is the kind of models we're building in our world, talking about the relationship between small vessel brain disease and its effect on cognition, movement, and mood. Important underlying drivers are blood pressure regulation, leading to these age-related white matter abnormalities, which contribute to cognitive impairment, executive dysfunction, movement, gait abnormalities, and, by the way, also mood symptoms. I don't know if any of you saw the release from the Alzheimer's Association yesterday saying that they had discovered the relationship between gait and cognition. Some of us in aging objected to that. They said they discovered it, being that the stuff's been being published for over 10 years. Some of the things that are particularly interesting about this is it's not necessarily a gray matter or neuronal issue as much as it is the wiring. And you can identify so the white matter hyperintensities tend to be in these areas where the interneuronal connections in tracts are coordinating different neural regions, and you can identify specific tracts and their roles and look at how they impact on posture, gait, cognition, and mood. For those of you who don't follow this world, there is a huge literature about the impact of things like exercise on neurobiology. And so you can look at the effects of exercise on learning, mediated by a bunch of the kind of mediators and neurotransmitters that you've been thinking about a little bit here, also influences on neurogenesis and angiogenesis. And I think this is just a focus on the brain here, but these kinds of effects of exercise are also relevant throughout the central nervous system out to the neuromuscular junction. Oh, there's supposed to be one more. It went away, sorry. So just briefly then, if I were to be given the opportunity to say where we should go with this, I'd like to say that even in your animal models, you can be measuring movement. There is a whole world of behavioral paradigms for looking at mobility and balance in rodents and other animals. I'd like you to consider including the nervous system in your studies of the regulation of bone-muscle interactions in normal and pathologic states. And I'd like you to consider incorporating the role of fat and leptin into your studies. Thank you very much.
Stephanie. We do have time for a couple of questions, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. But if you could field a few questions for a few minutes, that would be terrific.
Thank you for bringing up the issue of the nervous system, because actually it came to my mind while Steve Cummings was giving his presentation that a marker-based criterion for so-called sarcopenia, he was focusing on muscle. And I've thought ever since I think the NIH had a sarcopenia workshop that I attended back in the early 1990s, where a neurobiologist made a case that neuromuscular junction plasticity was very important, that there was breakdown and renewal of neuromuscular end plates, and he thought that these were inefficient. In the same way that those of us in the bone field know that remodeling in adults is inefficient. And that is the basis, so-called remodeling imbalance is the basis for age-related bone loss. And maybe remodeling insufficiency in neuromuscular junctions could be the basis for muscle loss with age and loss of muscle function. But in the bone field, we have some terrific markers that you can measure in the blood of both elements of the remodeling cycle, resorption and formation. And the question that I have posed to you is, are there things that one could measure easily in people that would mark both the deterioration of neuromuscular end plates as well as their formation? And if there aren't, maybe that would be one excellent goal for development.
Absolutely. So as you probably know, there's interest in those markers of turnover for muscle, and obviously one of the simplest is creatinine excretion. There's a number of other markers, and there's a recent publication looking at muscle synthesis and degradation turnover markers that might be useful. I did a little reading about where we're at with the neuromuscular junction because in animal models there has been some early development of markers of turnover, but they don't exist in humans yet. I think there are some things you can do in histology that already exist. In terms of the larger sense of mobility, I think the challenge is that it's not my purpose to talk about it today, but a framework for talking about factors that influence mobility includes strength a lot, but it includes a really lot of other stuff. And so one of the challenges we have when we try to look at the relationship between strength and mobility is there are many, many other influential factors, including sensory functions, including pain, including multiple nervous system functions. So it's tricky.
Good morning. Vince Caiozzo from University of California at Irvine. One of the more famous studies in the field of sarcopenia is the studies by Lexall, who looked at changes in the number of muscle fibers going from the 2nd to the 8th decade of life, and he showed about a 40% reduction. Interestingly enough, also I believe there was a 40% reduction in the cell bodies of motor neurons. So your talk is really interesting. So number one, I'm wondering if you could give us maybe an update on where the field stands with regards to the aging of the spinal cord, and also what is known about central pattern generators, because they're so important in terms of locomotor function and patterns that I hope somebody's studying that. So thank you.
I am aware of an NIA-funded large study trying to get a better handle on the aging spinal cord, because it's very understudied. We know a lot more about the brain and the very periphery. My understanding is, again, that there's a lot of this shrinking and loss of arborization, but you just do a cross-section of your classic butterfly in the spinal cord, and you see shrinking. But as much of that is smaller neurons with less arbors. You're probably, I'm sure, also very aware of all this reinnervation patterns that happen with aging in terms of type 1 and type 2 fibers and the loss of the checkerboard. So there's a lot of exciting and interesting things that can be done to better study the role of the spinal cord. As I understand the central pattern generator, it's not the problem. In terms of, I'm very interested in abnormalities of gait and gait irregularity, and a lot of that is much, much more up above there in terms of modulation. And so that automaticity, for the most part, is not the major driver of changes in walking with older people.
We're going to have to close it there, but there will be some time for discussion after all the presentations. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for a really nice presentation. So Eric introduced me before. I'm Roger Fielding.